Hello, welcome to session 4 of the 6-part Synodality in Perspective series. I am Il Kim, interim president of the American Cusanus Society, co-organizing the series with Nova Forum and the Lumen Christi Institute, two of its co-sponsors. The remaining co-sponsors are Commonweal, American Media, the St. Anselm Institute for Catholic Thought, and the Collegium Institute. I encourage you to go to each of our websites to learn more about our programs and activities. Each session comprises 2 speakers hosted by a moderator. This evening's moderator is Dr. Aristotle Papanikolaou. Dr. Papanikolaou is professor of theology, the Archbishop Demetrios Chair of Orthodox Theology and Culture, and the co-director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University. He is also senior fellow at Emory University's Center for the Study of Law and Religion. In 2012, he received the Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching in the Humanities. Among his numerous publications, he is the author of Being with God, Trinity, Apophaticism, and Divine Human Communion, 2006, and The Mystical as Political, Democracy and Non-Radical Orthodoxy, 2012. He is also co-editor of Political Theologies in Orthodox Christianity, 2017, Fundamentalism or Tradition, Christianity After Secularism, 2019, Christianity, Democracy, and Shadow of Constantine, 2016, and this is the winner of 2017 Alpha Sigma Nu Award in Theology. Next is Orthodox Constructions of the West, 2013, Orthodox Readings of Augustine, 2008, and Thinking Through Faith, New Perspectives from Orthodox Christian Scholars, 2008. Dr. Papanikolaou enjoys Russian literature, Byzantine and Greek music, and food. Telly, please start.
Thank you very much. My gratitude to the co-sponsors for having me here as a moderator. And we're here to discuss in the series itself, I have to put my glasses now, the question of what can Latin Rite Roman Catholics learn from Orthodox and Eastern Catholic traditions? It's a question I'm kind of curious about as well. And I'm actually very honored and privileged to be introducing, I think, 2 people who can really, who can really answer it better than anybody. And so we're looking forward to a very good and lively discussion. So I'll begin. I will introduce our speakers, and I will then we will kind of turn to the Q&A. And we look forward to hopefully being able to somehow answer this question today. So I will begin by introducing both speakers, and then we'll begin with Dr. J.Z. Joseph, who received her PhD in systematic theology from Boston College, and is currently an assistant professor of ecclesiology and theology of ministry at Villanova University. With interest primarily in ecclesiology and theological anthropology, her main areas of research involve understandings of unity and difference in the Catholic Church, how these definitions have shifted over the centuries, and how erroneous expressions have wounded the bonds of communion between different peoples. These differences are not only intercultural and ecumenical, but also involve almost invisible ancient Eastern Catholic churches that have been present since the first centuries in North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Eastern Europe. She's also committed to understanding how globalization and migration have brought all of these differences to the United States in the past 50 years, and how these diasporas influence understandings of Catholicity for the Church of the 3rd millennium. Aside from the academy, she is very involved in the lay ministry of the Syro-Malabar Catholic Diocese of Chicago, which spans across the United States to unite nearly 40 parishes and 40 missions. Chicago is my hometown. Her primary concern is to work with the emerging second generation of this immigrant community, particularly regarding issues of identity, domestic violence, and intergenerational healing. And after Dr. Joseph, we'll have Father Archimandrite Cyril Havaroun, is a professor in ecclesiology, good friend, international relations, ecumenism at the University College in Stockholm, a graduate of the Theological Academy in Kyiv and National University in Athens. He accomplished his doctoral studies at Durham University under the supervision of the well-known scholar Father Andrew Louth. He was a chairman of the Department of External Church Relations of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, first deputy chairman of the Educational Committee of the Russian Orthodox Church, and later research fellow at Yale, Columbia, visiting professor at the University of Münster in Germany, director of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount University in LA, and assistant professor at the same university. He's an international fellow at Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta in Canada, and an invited professor at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He has published several books in different languages, including Eastern Christianity, its texts, Sacred Architecture in East and West, Political Orthodoxies and Orthodoxies of the Church Coerced, Ukrainian Public Theology, Scaffolds of the Church Towards Post-Structural Ecclesiology, Wonders of the Pan-Orthodox Council, Meta-Ecclesiology, Chronicles of Church Awareness, From Antioch to Christian and Evolution of Nestorianism, Will, Action, and Freedom, Christological Controversies in the 7th Century. So we have two very learned, very accomplished scholars and theologians being able to speak to our topic today. And Jay-Z, we will begin with you, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Telly. And before I begin, I just want to thank Lumen Christi and all the co-sponsors who worked behind the scenes to make this event possible. And I also want to thank you all who are joining us this evening for making time, and I look forward to the Q&A. So synodality from a Syro-Malabar Catholic perspective. On October 10, 2021, Pope Francis officially opened the 2-year Synod on Synodality with a Mass at St. Peter's Basilica. This invitation to the global church to partake in the synodal process seeks to revive one of the oldest traditions of church governance, a standard in the life of the early church. Pope Francis's insistence that synodality is, quote, a constitutive element of the church, draws from both the Second Vatican Council's recovery of the church as the people of God and its teachings on a collegial mode of church governance. For Syro-Malabar Catholics, this collegial mode is reflected in the ancient yogam structures that at one point involved clergy and laity at all levels, an anomaly within the wider Christian tradition. The first part of my paper will explore the historical conditions that allowed for a strong presence of laity in the ecclesial decision-making structures of this apostolic church. The second part of my paper will consider how this involvement was both reduced through the Latinization efforts of the Portuguese and have been gradually recovered after Vatican II, though not to its former status. Finally, I will briefly consider some issues that remain in light of the complicated history of the Syro-Malabar Church. So part 1, the Syro-Malabar Church is inherently synodal. We must first briefly contextualize the Syro-Malabar Catholics within the wider scope of Christian history. First, this church is in continuity with the ancient apostolic church of St. Thomas, which took root in India during the 1st century. The relative isolation of the Thomas Christians from the traditional epicenters of Christianity enabled a certain level of autonomy regarding the development of a distinct way of life, known as the Marthoma Margam, or the way/law of Thomas, which preserved their faith in a predominantly Hindu context. As Xavier Cortopera argues, this ancient church's, quote, existence outside the Greco-Roman world has helped her to safeguard the uniqueness of the early Christian traditions, free from the political and religious reality of the Roman Empire, end quote. Because the Thomas Christians were not influenced by the same politics of empire that contributed to the adoption of hierarchical models and a widening distinction between the clergy and laity, the Thomas Christians were able to maintain a more collegial, synodal form of church governance. While structures of episcopacy quickly developed in the West, the Thomas Christians only came under the Persian episcopate in the 4th century through the arrival of Syrian Christians fleeing persecution. While the Persian bishops maintained hierarchical monopoly by forbidding the ordination of indigenous bishops, they only concerned themselves with spiritual matters and did not learn the local language or customs of the Malabar coast. The Thomas Christians, therefore, were free to maintain and develop autonomous structures of governance such as the indigenous Shatika Karthavin, who was recognized as the archdeacon within the Persian ecclesial structures, and the Yogam, or General Assembly, which dealt with day-to-day realities of living as a Christian minority within a Hindu kingdom. Just as the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West, respectively, used secular terms like synodos and concilium to describe their assemblies, so too the Thomas Christians drew the idea of yogam from the local structures of government in Malabar society. Varghese Palathinkal describes how, quote, the elders of the tribes met together in villages to discuss, consult, and decide on matters of common interest. It was an authoritative body. Leaders of all families or the elders participated in the meeting. This was known as yogam, which was presided by the head of the tribe. All members except the king were equal. The decisions taken in the yogam were binding to all, end quote. Among Thomas Christians, Paul Paleth argues, episcopal synods were not possible due to the lack of indigenous bishops. Nevertheless, as Benny Tharkonul maintains, the organic development of yogams, which governed at three levels, the local, regional, and general, were, quote, analogous to that of the ancient synods and ecclesial assemblies, which confronted serious problems that one bishop could not resolve by himself. From the perspective of foreign missionaries, these ancient yogams were praiseworthy, particularly because of the lack of a clergy-laity polarization in the joint administration of all temporal needs. So at the first level, the local level, and under the leadership of a senior priest, the Palyogams, or parish assemblies, included the lay, who were mostly male and upper caste, heads of each Christian family, the religious, and the clergy of a parish. Here, Palathinkal argues, we see the direct participation of the people of God in the mission and governance of the church. Discussing all matters pertaining to the life of the parish, both parishioners and priests were bound by the legislative, administrative, and judicial decisions made by the assembly. Such decisions, for example, include selecting and approving candidates for the priesthood. Without the approval of the Palyogam, again the local level, a priest could not be ordained. This certificate of synod was called deshakuri, and those without one were not accepted or received by their church. Other responsibilities included financial administration, the punishment and excommunication of public sinners, and the issuing of penance. The laity collaborated with the parish priest in his pastoral ministry by being co-responsible for the spiritual, educational, financial, and cultural decisions of the parish. Second, the Desha Yogam, or regional assembly, consisted of priests and laity from at least 4 parishes of a region. It was the ancient custom of Thomas Christians that no grave crime could be punished until it was proven before the representatives of 4 parishes. The decisions of the Desha Yoga not only protected against unjust punishments of innocent people, but also ensured ecclesial communion between churches. Finally, at the highest level, the Mahayogam, or General Assembly, convoked and presided over by the archdeacon, addressed issues that concerned the whole church. Not only were all priests present, but also up to 4 lay representatives from each local parish, thus making up the majority. One primary responsibility of the Mahayogam included selecting members to travel to monasteries in Babylon to select a bishop. Eminent Sir Malabar theologian Placid Poripara defines the full dignity and autonomy of the Thomas Christians through this particular ecclesial structure of the Mahayogam, which involved all aspects of the church, lay, clergy, and religious, in decision-making processes. He states that, quote, the general church assemblies were practically supreme, and de facto no higher ecclesiastical authority questioned their decisions. The Thomas Christians therefore formed, as it were, a Christian republic with a head from among themselves. Their bishops, who were foreigners, were eclipsed by or were under the shadow of the archdeacons. Such was the canonical setup that developed among St. Thomas Christians of the past, end quote. So except for the right to elect and consecrate bishops, the archdeacon and the yogams possessed the practical autonomy of a patriarchal church. The East Syrian bishops hardly disturbed or questioned the decisions that emerged from these indigenous ecclesial structures of decision-making. Whether diplomatic or deceptive, the Portuguese missionaries, under the Latin leadership of Archbishop Alexis de Menendez, coaxed the Thomas Christians into attending the Synod of Diamper in 1599 as if it were a Mahayoga. This General Assembly, however, was not a platform to voice concerns and make decisions for the mutual building up of the church. Rather, it was a monarchical strategy employed to diminish the Thomas Christians to a Latin conformity. Part 2, Engaging the West. The Synod of Diamper represents a culmination of Latinizing efforts that first began by covertly ordaining indigenous priests through newly established Latin seminaries and detaining Persian bishops in Goa. Far from a meeting of equal parties, the Portuguese heavily restricted any expression of dissent. In reality, the 660 lay Thomas Christians and 153 native priests in attendance followed a foreign Latin script under the threat of excommunication and the imperial gaze of the Portuguese guards, hidalgos, and noblemen. While the Portuguese seemed to interpret the Thomas Christian stance to safeguard their apostolic heritage as a denial of the See of Peter, the Thomas Christians simply wanted to preserve their way of life as it had organically developed on the Malabar coast. This forced renunciation of their lifestyle, when understood with greater clarity, was interpreted as the greatest affront to the identity of the Thomas Christians. The changes that this oath would soon enact within the Martha Margam, the way and life of St. Thomas, completely denied their autonomy and freedom to express their distinct Christian worldview. After nearly 3 centuries under Latin jurisdiction, the Holy See finally listened to the pleas of Thomas Christians and separated this ancient church from the Latin Church in 1887 through the creation of 2 vicariates. Taking on the name Syro-Malabar to recognize their Syrian Christian heritage and their residence on the Malabar coast of India, they were also allowed indigenous bishops for the first time and 1 more vicariate in 1896. Both decisions presented major steps in restoring the lost autonomy of Thomas Christians. The wounds of Latinization were further recognized when the Second Vatican Council promulgated Orientalium Ecclesiarum in 1964, recognizing that Catholicism does not equal Latinism, and that the Eastern Catholic churches present legitimate diversity within the Christian tradition. Such recognition was seen as a great achievement by the Eastern Fathers at the Council and a validation that the law of Thomas is not in competition with the law of Peter. Since the Council, the Syro-Malabar Church has worked hard to remove Latinizations and restore the system of yogams as the basic unit of ecclesial communion. The process, of course, has not been easy. After being raised to a major archiepiscopal status in 1992, the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church promulgated the particular law of Palyogam, including its procedural rules, which is now fully practiced throughout the diaspora, though in limited form. In the procedures followed by the Syro-Malabar Catholic Diocese of Chicago, some notable elements reflect an emerging consciousness. First, though the predominant way of accounting for membership is through the number of families, single women and men over the age of 21 may be considered the equivalent of a family unit. Moreover, anyone, male or female, may be considered the head of a family and therefore have a voice in the Palyogam. The inclusion of women is an important marker of progress. Also, the Kaikaren is a lay individual who is either selected by the pastoral council or elected by the Palyogam to assist the priest in all temporal affairs. There are 2 per parish, and in addition to being in good standing with the church, they cannot come from the same household. Therefore, husband and wife from the same family or brother and sister can't be Kaikarens at the same time. These individuals are given the keys at the threshold of the church, where they take an oath to care for the church honestly and with integrity, along with the pastor during their term. These customs are meant to ensure the co-responsibility of the clergy and the laity for the well-being and building up of the church. Part 3, issues remain. Yet, of course, synodality is not a panacea for all of the church's ills. As recently as August 8, 2022, nearly 50,000 Syro-Malabar Catholics took to the streets in protest over the recent removal of their Archbishop, Mar Anthony Carayet, who defined a synodal decision for uniformity in the Syro-Malabar liturgy. This recent episode of liturgical tensions is part of a larger post-conciliar tension that is connected to the loss of autonomous status following colonization. Because there was no unified head until 1992, the Syro-Malabar Church functioned as a few eparchies, practicing the East Syriac Rite without autonomous status or a bishop synod. Following the example of the Latin churches after Vatican II, some eparchies, such as the one under Carrel, began celebrating the liturgy with the priest facing the people. This change occurred without any deliberation with other eparchies, which continue the practice of facing the altar. Despite repeated calls from Rome for a unified liturgy, the Curbana, or the liturgy, continued to be practiced both ad popularum, facing the people, and ad orientem, facing the east or the altar. With the elevation of the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church to archiepiscopal status, again in 1992, the church was now officially self-governing with a major archbishop and a synod of bishops. Through the creation of a liturgical research center and serious study and deliberation of the matter, the Bishops' Synod in 1999 would decide on a compromise formula through which the priest faces the people during the liturgy of the word and faces the altar during the liturgy of the Eucharist. Nevertheless, no effort was made by certain eparchies to follow this rule. While these issues remain in Kerala, India, there's a large migrant population who has brought their different liturgical formations to the newly established Syro-Malabar eparchies in the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. With the dissimilarities now becoming a pastoral issue abroad, the bishops turned to Pope Francis, who intervened in July 2022, and who exhorted, quote, all the clergy, religious, and lay faithful to proceed to a prompt implementation of the uniform mode of celebrating the Holy Kurbana for the greater good and unity of your church, end quote. In August 2022, the Holy Synod of the Syro-Malabar Church approved the introduction of the uniform liturgy agreed upon in 1999 in all eparchies. It hoped to complete the transition by Easter Sunday 2022, but unfortunately, 3 eparchies have resisted and protests continue. So on the surface, this tension could be reduced to the direction the priest faces during the liturgy. At the heart of the conflict, however, is a struggle for identity, emerging from deep colonial wounds that disrupted an entire way of life in the Christian tradition. While the laity participate only in temporal matters in the yogam structure and not in the articulation of theology, liturgy, or spirituality, this specific case does raise interesting questions about what it means when the magisterium intervenes. What is the relationship between yogams and bishops? What is the proper formation of laity? And how does one discern the sensus fidei? Moreover, how does the Christian individual or community respond when a final synodal decision has been discerned that is the opposite of their wishes? In many ways, this case study reflects 2 theological knots that the International Theological Commission recognized at the end of their 2018 study of synodality. One, quote, there is the question concerning the relationship between the participation in synodal life by all the baptized, in whom the Spirit of Christ arouses and nourishes the sensus fidei, and the consequent competence and responsibility in the discernment of mission, and the authority proper to pastors, which derives from a specific charism that is conferred sacramentally. And 2, how much pertains to legitimate plurality of forms expressing faith in various cultures, and what belongs to its perennial identity and Catholic unity. Both questions suggest a deeper need for ecclesial conversion and the cultivation of ecclesial habits, such as patience, communal discernment, and trust that we are ultimately led by the one who is the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stacey. We'll have time to ask you some questions and to discuss further all that you've taught us, actually. So Father Cyril, it's now your turn, and we'll give you the screen, I guess.
Right, thank you. Thank you, JC, also for your presentation. I'd like to take from it an insight that regardless whether an Eastern Church is with unity in Rome or not in unity with Rome, it has a strong feeling of synodality, synodality as identity. And I'd like to start my presentation with this point, that synodality or conciliarity has become and is perceived within the Eastern Christianity and outside Eastern Christianity as a distinct identity of Eastern Christianity. Sometimes within Eastern Christianity, synodality or conciliarity is perceived as a feature which differentiates Eastern Christianity from the Western Christianity. In a sense, it has become like a point that the Eastern Christians use in order to demonstrate why they are different, why they are not like, you know, the Western Christians, like the Catholics, as they say. Essentially, their point can be summarized in the way that, well, they say we are the synodal church, the church that cherishes synodality, that is built on synodality and conciliarity. So, identity or synodality has become an identity in the East, in the Christian East. I would argue that this is a relatively new identity in the Christian East, and certainly it has somehow, as an identity, it has departed from the reality of the Eastern Christianity, because, as a matter of fact, in the Christian East, we haven't had, conciliar events which would be accepted and covering the entire Eastern Christianity, like the entire Orthodoxy. There was a struggle for several decades to have a pan-Orthodox council. This struggle started in the wake of Vatican II, the council that actually did happen in the Catholic Church, even though we in the East we prefer to say that the Catholic Church or the Church of the West, they kind of diminish the role of the councils, but the Catholic Church did have a council, and this council, Vatican II, instigated somehow a similar processes of preparing our own pan-Orthodox council in the Christian East. So we tried to prepare this council for several decades. The process started in 1961 with the first pan-Orthodox consultation on the Greek island of Rhodes, and this process, it had its ups and downs, and there were periods when the process was almost frozen, then it was resumed again, and eventually concluded with the Pan-Orthodox Council in June 2016 on the Greek island of Crete. This council, however, did not happen in the way as it had been envisaged during this process of preparing for this council. Several churches, including the Russian Church, the largest in numbers, did not attend the council, and even doubted the kind of that was a legitimate council, and this demonstrated, first of all, the crisis of the process of synodality in the Eastern Christianity, and second, it demonstrated also the crisis of identity in the Christian East. So that we could say that if we are the Church of the Councils, if we are the Synodal Church, why we were unable, and we still are unable, to convene a council, a proper council. We tried to convene a pan-Orthodox council, and we essentially failed to convene a council that all of us wanted to have. So I think it says this kind of the Council of Crete in 2016 became a major challenge to the Orthodox identity as a Church of the Synods and as the Church of the Councils. This is kind of one point that I wanted to raise: the crisis of synodality as an identity, as it emerged out of following the Pan-Orthodox Council in Crete. The second point I wanted to raise, and it is also related to identity. I mentioned in the beginning that in my judgment, the idea of conciliarity, the idea of synodality as an identity again, not as an institution, not as a kind of as the processes, ecclesial processes that take part in the church, but as an identity, emerged relatively recently. I would argue that like a key figure in articulating conciliarity as an identity was the Russian theologian, lay theologian in the 19th century, Alexei Khomyakov, who coined this word sobornost, which can be rendered as conciliarity or synodality. He promoted this idea of conciliarity, sobornost, as distinctively Orthodox, Eastern, and opposite to the Western primacy of the popes, and well, Khomyakov essentially put or expressed the idea of conciliarity like in trichotomic way, not just dichotomic way. On the one hand, there was an Eastern conciliarity, which he promoted as a distant identity of the East, of the Christian East. Then, on the other hand, there was papacy, which he didn't like, and he believed that it is contrary to synodality as such. And the third part of this trichotomic idea that he promoted was the assumed chaos, ecclesial organizational chaos of the churches of the Reformation. So Khomyakov essentially counterposed the idea of synodality as distinctively Orthodox, constructive, and differentiating the Eastern Christianity from two sorts of Western Christianity, well, papacy, as he described it, and the churches of the Reformation. So the idea of sobornost, essentially, in the 19th century, was articulated by Khomyakov, and later on was accepted in this interpretation by his followers as a distinctively Orthodox identity. In Khomyakov's interpretation, it should be mentioned that this idea also was called to stress a special role that the Russian society and the Russian church played in the global Christianity. Khomyakov was a kind of a romantic thinker who believed that the almost an ideal incarnation of this idea of synodality was a community of peasants, of Russian peasants. And essentially he saw the incarnation of the idea of synodality in the contemporary Russian society, which he counterposed to the Western societies as decaying, as heretical, as essentially apostatic in his own kind of vision. With the birth of the birth of the idea of synodality concurred chronologically with the enhancement of the idea of the Russian exceptionalism, which we now call the Russian civilization exceptionalism. Therefore, I would argue, and this is kind of my personal argument, is that the idea of synodality was abused somehow and contributed to the growth of the modern phenomenon of the Russian civilizational exceptionalism that ended up in the war which Russia has launched. And it's not just a speculation. I believe I find some statements and formulas expressed by different figures in the Russian church and political establishment that corroborate this kind of hypothesis. For example, on the 5th of September this year, Vladimir Putin signed a document, a Russian document, which is called like the concept of cultural policy of the Russian Federation abroad. And this document explicitly mentions the idea of collectiveness, of communitarianism, which is pertinent to the specifically Russian civilization. And this idea resembles, this Homekovian concept of sobornost, of conciliarity, even though the document does not mention, literally this idea, but it certainly implies this idea. So in this case, we are dealing with the attempts to justify a uniquely Russian civilization on the basis of the idea of synodality, of conciliarity. So in this context, in this particular case, the idea of conciliarity or synodality or slash synodality, this idea as an identity has contributed to, I believe, to a very destructive phenomenon of what has been branded Russian world. Essentially, the Russian world is, perceived by many as an amalgamation of this idea of conciliarity and synodality. And essentially, we are talking about an abuse of the concept of synodality slash conciliarity in this particular case. So we are having now two manifestations, or two cases of conciliarity, synodality not working well in the Eastern Christian context. One is the case of the Pan-Orthodox Council, which did not work as people wanted it to work, and thus demonstrated that synodality is merely an identity, not really a reality of our church life, unfortunately, in the Christian East. And then the concept of the Russian world that demonstrates that synodality can be abused as an identity and can lead to the sort of exceptionalism that this Russian world promotes and amalgamates. And I believe we are dealing with these abuses of synodality because this idea of synodality is perceived as an identity, not a reality which is to be implemented. We perceive in the Christian East, unfortunately, synodality is something which is given, which is not something that needs to be achieved, needs to be struggled for. It's not that we need really to work hard to achieve on the everyday basis, but it's something which we have received from God, as a gift, and we don't have to do anything in order to implement it in our lives, in the life of our churches. So when we have this idea of synodality as a gift, as given, not something to be gained, then we end up in the situation like with this Pan-Orthodox Council in Crete, and a really tragic case of the Russian world ideology. If, say, we really struggled to make synodality a reality of our church and not just an identity, then I believe we would be able to avoid many crises that we are facing nowadays. Let us take the situation in the Russian Church. The Russian Church, its leader, Patriarch Kirill, and I can attest it because I witnessed how he really cared, how he really wanted in the beginning of his tenure as the Patriarch to enhance the institutes of synodality, of conciliarity within the Russian Church. For that purpose, for example, he reestablished an institute which he called Межсоборное присутствие. Well, literally, it means interconciliar presence. It sounds awkward a bit in English, but it is a reference to a similar institution that existed in the Russian Church just before the Bolshevik Revolution in the beginning of the 20th century. That was a process that was envisaged as a helping instrument to prepare the Great Council, which eventually happened in the Russian Church in 1917, 1918, the so-called Moscow, Great Council of Moscow. So a long process, which took several years, preceded this council, and this process was called the предсоборное присутствие, the presence before ante-council presence, so to say, which included establishing different commissions, different sessions that included scholars, theologians, hierarchs, lay people. Importantly, lay people in the beginning of the 20th century participated actively in preparing this great council of the Russian Church. So Patriarch Kirill wanted to establish something like that under his tenure, during his tenure, and he managed to establish this institute that was supposed to facilitate the work of the councils, different sorts of councils within the Russian Church. But what happened to this institute is the same as what happened to the councils as such. I believe they turned into a sort of simulacra of synodality, without really a synodal process, without really, a responsible and active participation of the members of the councils and of this institute of synodal priest or intersynodal consultations. Their participation nowadays is more passive than active. Their role is more to agree, to accept what they've been told to accept, instead of really participating in the discussions. And I think that it has led to the situation when the Russian Church is now having only one voice, and this voice is the one that supports the war, for example, and other conciliar councils, they keep silent, surprisingly. So with all the variety, seemingly, right, of the conciliar instruments and institutions within the Russian Church, no, not a single institute, conciliar institute, works in order to prevent the war, works in order to say something against the war. They either appease, they either accept and support, endorse what the Patriarch is saying, or they just keep silent. And I believe this is the third example of a major failure of the conciliar institutes within Orthodoxy. Well, that's kind of my rather pessimistic take on the institutes, on conciliarity and synodality, and it has to do exactly with. I was not surprised by Telly's reaction to the main question of our conversation, whether the East can teach the West something about synodality. I wonder myself whether we can teach something substantial, something that we really live, not just promote, say about, or tell. That's something that we do in our work, in our life as churches. I wonder myself. I would finish my intervention with a more optimistic kind of note. The failure of the Institutes of Synodality in the East means that we didn't work enough. It means that we've accepted synodality as our identity without really feeling that we need to actualize this synodality, that we need really to put some effort to make synodality working in the church. So the crisis that I've indicated should push us actually to do something about synodality, not just to treasure it, as a gem, precious gem. No, but to put it to work, to make effort to implement synodality in the work in the life of our church. So that's like a task. Synodality for us, I believe, it's not an identity. It should not be an identity. It should be primarily the task, the main task for the churches. Thank you.
Thank you both very, very much. So let me start off with a few questions. I guess we're supposed to be talking about what the Latin Rite Catholic Church can learn from both. And so if I guess, JC, to you, I'll say, like, from what you lifted up, I mean, what would you like to see implemented in the broader? I mean, you're speaking to a situation in which a community has had to conform in a way that's obviously you're kind of indicating is unjust and unfair and doesn't take into account particularities of the local churches, right? Of the local space, the local geography. Synod has something to do with space, with geography, with land, with, you know, something material in that sense, right? And but let's flip it. I mean, to some extent you could say, well, perhaps uniformity is just a bad word, right? But what would you like to see uniform throughout the Catholic Church that you see in the Syro-Malabar Church? I mean, no, seriously. I mean, what would you like? Let's flip it. What would you like to see be uniform in that sense as they go through this process of synodality?
Yeah, I think one of the main points that I wanted to communicate in my talk was that this distinction between clergy and lay is not an absolute. It's not as in. So if we were to look sort of in the Western Church, maybe I think in the 3rd or 4th centuries, there's more of a reification of this distinction, whereas before it might have been this universal call to discipleship. That was sort of the governing factor. Now it was sort of, there were 2 kinds of Christians, and it sort of became more and more distinguished. And so I think in the structures of Yogam, YOGAM, I wanted to highlight that at least until the arrival of the Portuguese in the 15th century, there were structures that really did listen to and incorporate lay people in decision-making processes. That's not sort of brand new. And so in a sense, you know, when we are when Catholics are responding to Pope Francis's invitation to be a more synodal church, I think after the Second Vatican Council, you see sort of this expansion of the primacy, not of the Pope not being alone, but there's a synod of bishops, the collegiality aspect taken from the East, and now sort of synodality incorporating all of the baptized. And so that's not brand new. It's always been part of the tradition.
But is it? But I think it is brand new, because I think I'm thinking about, and Father Cyril, I have a follow-up for you as well. But I was just continuing on this point. I think conciliarity, primacy, which I want to get to in a few minutes, is not brand new, right? We know that those debates occurred in the 15th and the 16th centuries, and the Pope won out, I guess. But I just occurred to me that even though ecumenical councils were ultimately called by the emperor, but there were local synodal councils that he didn't necessarily call. So the synodal system didn't necessarily develop as a result of the imperial structures. In other words, they weren't necessarily called because of imperial structures. However, I cannot think, this webinar has made me think, I cannot think of a single point in history in any Christian church where the laity have been part of a synodal structure. I mean, it is new in post-Vatican II. It is new in Orthodox churches in the diaspora that have parish councils and things like that. It is absolutely new in those contexts. And so to some extent, the unique history that you're pointed to is really, really unique, like really radical in some sense, because laity have been really part of a synodal process in a way that has not been the case anywhere in the history of the churches.
Yes, but I think a part of it is also it was a small minority community. It never had power in the wider society, and so there might have been, though maybe that was part of the reason that the laity took such responsibility with the smaller numbers of clergy. So I wonder if those socio-political dynamics also impact the kind of responsibility that lay people felt.
Well, it's a question worth asking in terms of illuminating the synodal structures that have existed in the Orthodox and the Catholic churches, the Latin Rite Catholic churches. But it's worth further investigating how those structures have developed in ways that don't mirror the kind of history that you're pointing to.
Yeah.
Right. And Father Cyril, I am going to have to push you a little bit. You're going to have to tell us, is there anywhere in the Orthodox Church in the world where the synodal system works? In other words, can you point to anywhere where it kind of works in some way, in some way? Saying, like, does it work we know, you and I know for sure it doesn't work ideally and doesn't match anywhere near the theology of conciliarity that we talk about and so on and so forth, which I think is what people mean when, what can the Latin Rite Church learn, right? It's really more the theology rather than what's on the ground. But with that said, is there anywhere in the Orthodox world where you think it kind of works in a pretty good way?
Well, yes. The answer to this question is very simple. I believe that synodality, well, speaking historically, speaking empirically, or judging empirically, synodality works much better in the societies, in the environments which are democratic or republican.
I would agree with that.
Like, for example, you mentioned the participation of laity. Actually, in the Christian East, it started the so-called clerical synelevsis, the clergy laity congresses, took part in the Balkans, first in Greece, and then later on in Bulgaria and Serbia, following the wave of emancipation, of separating from the Ottoman Empire and developing, republican institutes in the Greek and other Balkan societies.
And they got transferred to the diaspora communities afterwards.
Exactly. If you take Russia, for example, the Great Council of Moscow, which I mentioned, 1917, 1918, which was really a huge step forward in terms of emancipation. I think it was really a predecessor of Vatican II. And it embarked on the program of aggiornamento, 50 years before Vatican II. And it happened during this very short period of time when Russia was a republic. Russia was established as a republic following the revolution of February 1917, when the imperial regime, the Tsarist regime, fell. And then it lasted only half a year until essentially October 1917, when the republic was actually destroyed by the Bolshevik dictatorship. Right, during this very short period of time, several months, the council commenced its work and actually amalgamated the spirit of republic. Then in our times, I believe the most conciliar churches are the ones that exist in the most democratic societies among the traditional Orthodox countries like Greece and Cyprus. Greece and Cyprus are the most democratic countries with the Orthodox kind of background in the European Union. And they have the most democratic and conciliar institutions for their churches. Like in Cyprus, they elect their bishops. In Greece, the synod is the most important institute of governance in the church. It's not archbishop. Archbishop just
and it works pretty well. It doesn't it doesn't allow anyone, even though there's an archbishop, it doesn't allow any one of them to.
And the third example is the Church of Finland, which is also probably one of probably the most democratic church in the Orthodox world, and that exists in one of the most democratic societies in Europe, in Finland. So that there is a clear correlation between the democratic setting of a society and the church, how it functions within this society.
But we can't really talk about, and we'll go to some of the questions too, but we can't really talk about synodality without talking about primacy. And so we have to, I think the Latin Rite churches are asking this question of us here, because there's a certain theology of primacy that they're discussing, debating, and has seemed to supersede, let's say, ways of thinking about conciliarity. So, I don't think I'm wrong on this. I've done a lot of ecclesiology work, but I don't think I'm wrong on this. Theologically or theoretically, the Pope can intervene in whatever diocese he wants at any time, at any point. I know he doesn't do that, but I'm just saying that is the kind of primacy he has, right? So I guess, do you have a thought about conciliarity and primacy? Do you think they mutually imply each other? Do they mutually check each other? JC?
Well, I was going to say, I think it is, when it works well, when it's not sort of abused, it's intended to be checks and balances in terms of, so for example, in this tension of a lack of uniformity with liturgy, the bishops went to the Pope to finally have the final answer, to sort of submit. And it was assumed that, I think that's part of the tension, right? The Pope ended up writing a letter, and yet there's still no obedience. And so what do you do, right? In the bishops appeal to the Pope wrote something, and then there's 50,000 Syro-Malabar Catholics who still resist. And so what does it mean to discern the proper course of action when all of the structures in place are not working?
Right.
But yeah.
Right. Father Cyril, any thoughts on this?
Yes, well, yes, it's a huge debate, of course, and I just want to advertise the study that we produced recently, Serving Communion. It's a study by the St. Irenaeus group, where we investigated for 10 years this correlation between synodality and primacy, and ended up with a common document written by Orthodox and Catholic theologians. I think it is probably the most advanced study on primacy in relation to synodality.
Well, I might check you on that, because I mean, the North American Catholic and Orthodox dialogue,
also, yes,
I want to put a plug in for them, because they have produced two very definitive documents on filioque and primacy. So
yeah,
I think it's good that there's some good American-European competition. But
okay. Well,
right,
some American,
I don't mind that. I don't mind that. But let's say both documents are excellent, then probably should be. Let's just say they probably should be referred to more often than they are. So, which speaks in many ways to the local, right? But I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
That's, I mean, there is an effort, a huge effort to study how primacy and synodality are related to each other. Well, my own take on it's a bit kind of outside the mainstream somehow, because primacy and synodality are believed to be on the equal footing, in kind of on the equal scale, balancing each other in the same way. I would argue a bit differently. I would suggest to consider primacy and synodality from the perspective, actually, of how I see my own ecclesiological project, so to say, is the one that differentiates between the nature and the structures of the church. Essentially, I argue that there is like the unchangeable, infallible part of the church, which is its nature, and then there are different structures of the church that kind of maintain this edifice of the church, the nature of the church, and help it to develop. So I would argue, and I know it's against the mainstream, that synodality belongs to the nature of the church. It's pertinent to the better nature of the church, while I would say primacy is not.
I mean, we can agree to disagree, because I think in many ways I would say there's a case could be made that the war, right, indicates the need for primacy in relationship to synodality. So in other words, what I mean to say by that is, you're indicating that in Russia you have primacy with no real synodality. I mean, that's the way Kirill has set it up. I mean, he's basically set it up where he is the ruler and everybody else. That's not the way it is in Greece. But at the global scale in Orthodoxy, what's lacking, and the war kind of, not simply the Council of 2016, but what the war brings out is the failure of the Orthodox churches to respond very strongly against Kirill's rhetoric, right? But that also indicates where primacy, a real primacy, could come in and coordinate the global churches in such a way that they could more effectively respond.
Yeah, well,
and I think because of their local synods, and they all kind of do what they want. Because one question here is, and this can dovetail into one of the questions now, because I could talk with you guys all night over a few beers, but we have to go to questions too. But one of the questions is a very good question in the sense of, and it's directed to you, Father Cyril, but Jason, you can chime in. But the challenges of the Russian church in relationship to the state influence, right? Yeah. And so how does that affect synodality? Now, just to complete my thought on the war, I think a lot of the local Orthodox churches, even though they have their own synodal structures, they have their own state interests in mind. And the state influence in that sense, which is keeping them from perhaps even reacting in the way that they might want to, which indicates perhaps a more transnational need, a need for more transnational primacy and so on and so forth. But getting to the general question, synodality in the state, let's say, I think, which is a real issue, So Father Cyril, why don't you go first, and JC, if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, we've mentioned the cases of Greece, Cyprus, Finland, where synodality really works, and we see the correlation of the synodality with the democratic regime, political condition in those countries. In Russia, it's the opposite. Well, when Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia lived again through another very short period of time of republicanism under Yeltsin, when it tried to be really democratic, and this became reflected also in the self-understanding of the church and the documents that the Russian church at the time adopted. In particular, I'd like to mention the social doctrine of the Russian church adopted in 2000. It was the year when Putin became the president. Succeeded Yeltsin. So this document, this Russian document, reflects this leaning towards democratization of the Russian society. That's why it contains some very good statements about the necessity of synodality and some concrete proposals for implementation of synodality. Later on, when Putin came to power, and especially during his third and fourth terms after 2008, after 2012, actually, when he kind of resumed power, we observe an increase of concentration of power in his hands. So we are dealing with a new monarchy, not hereditary monarchy, as in the case of the Russian Empire, but kind of a new monarchy that underpins this Putin's regime. And we are seeing the same kind of tendency towards monarchy, towards consolidation of power with one pairs of hands in the church, within the church. So the church keeps talking about synodality, but the reality is that the instruments, the real situation in the church is that it is monarchical. Is in the same way as Putin. Putin keeps talking about democracy. He believes that his Russia is democratic, and he believes that his country is the most democratic, among other countries. So the Russian church may believe that it is the most conciliar and synodal church among other churches, but in fact, it is probably one of the most monarchical churches in the Orthodox world. The same tendency we can observe in other churches that find themselves in the rather autocratic setting, like take the Middle East, the regimes there, how they affect the church and how the churches restructure themselves according to the political mainstream of their country. They grow increasingly monarchical and less synodal.
And also, this obviously the state. I mean, it's in the case of Syria. I mean, it really influences how.
Exactly. I didn't want to name the church, but no.
Yeah, I mean, it's But JC, did you have a thought on this? Yeah.
Well, no, specifically on the Russian church, I was excited to be on a panel with Cyril because I wanted to really understand his perspective on it. But I mean, if the underlying question is more general in terms of the relationship between, or how does the state influence synodality, I don't know if I could go in that direction a little bit, the relationship between state and, but there has been sort of some conversation on the US national synthesis that was just promulgated and sent to Rome a few weeks ago, in terms of how, just how to be synodal amidst the political polarization that is affecting the US. And so what does it mean to really truly be leaven in society, where the polarization, so to be leaven, instead of having society become leaven in the church, and these polarizations impact how we relate to one another or can't talk to one another despite sharing the same Eucharist. And so I think in that sense, what I'm hearing from Cyril's comments and from sort of this reflection on the US synthesis, there is a constant porosity between the state, what's going on in society, and the conversations of being in communion with one another here in within the church. And so I think that's just all I wanted to think through.
So we have a question here from Carrie Frederick Frost, who writes, I see the triumphalist concept of synodality as identity all over the Eastern Orthodox world, by no means limited to the Russian context. Specifically in reference to women, all laity, There are no examples of true synodal expressions of the Orthodox Church to date, in the sense of us all moving together on a common pilgrimage, to paraphrase the late and great Metropolitan Callistus Ware. And in parentheses, even though we can cite examples of very limited participation of women in various 20th and 21st century councils, women's participation is token. Do the two panelists have thoughts on women and synodality in terms of councils in the future? And sometimes I want to ask, did the Yorgums, you might have mentioned this and I just zoned out, but did the Yorgums, did they include women?
Yeah, so not historically, not, I would say, yeah, so historically it was the heads of families. So it was male heads of families. But that, and actually in 1998, that was changed. And I think it was more with a democratic consciousness in India. And so now I think the rule is that the Yogam, which must represent a third of the total membership of any parish, cannot have less than 10% female representation, and should strive for 30%, which still, it's nice that that's in the rules, but why not 50-50?
Right.
Just, so I think that there's a lot of work to be done, but at least in terms of the official procedures, there's some recognition of the necessity for women to be active.
And that perhaps is something that's needed within the wider Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches as well. I always compare the synods as like the House of Lords without the House of Commons in the Orthodox Church. Whether in fact they really need to expand. Anyway, but Father Shell, any thoughts on?
Well, I should say that
yeah.
quite interestingly, I think the only case when women can legitimately participate in the councils, well, in Russia, in the Russian Church, they have again two chambers, like the Lords and the Commons, the Bishops' Council, the Council of Bishops, and the so-called local council, where the representatives of the dioceses, like priests and lay people, participate. And the only legitimate way for women to participate in these local councils is to be nuns. So it's interesting that only the monastic institution was historically and continues to be the only, almost the main instrument of enabling women to participate in decision making within the church in the conciliar processes, which is it's a reality. We can take it in and judge this reality in different ways, but this is the reality. And of course, it's not enough, no doubt. It's a token. It's another manifestation of the monasticization of the church, right? Because the church has been monasticized since the late antiquity whatsoever, and it is another manifestation of this monasticization of the church, that the women are eligible to participate in the decision making in the church only if they are nuns. Well, it has to be changed, of course.
Yeah. So the question we had to discuss was, what can the Latin Rite Church learn from, the Orthodox and the Eastern Catholic churches? Why don't we just ask the question? What kind of synodal structures really would we like to see, just simply throughout the, Eastern Catholic, Greek Catholic, Orthodox, and Catholic churches? They share so much in common. They share this idea, this concept of synodality. What would we ideally like to see at the global, transnational, and even at the local levels? JC, do you want to go?
Yeah, I think specifically to the Syro-Malabar Catholic context, I would envision, if it was truly, taking up Pope Francis's challenge to listen to everyone, there being a wider receptivity to the experiences of Dalit Catholics, or a wider caste consciousness, and that would translate, in other contexts, wherever there is sort of the racial or caste or colonial dynamics that are still at play in the church, and how sort of, if we don't address it and seek healing within the church, there's no way that the church can fully be a sign and symbol of unity, or the reign of God, right? So to really, at least in the ceremony of our church in particular, the sort of casteism that's still present in covert ways, to really listen and be attentive to that, I think would be great.
Yeah, Father Cyril, what would you?
I would suggest that we, the Orthodox, probably need to adjust our practice of synodality to our theology of synodality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Catholic Church would be good to adjust its theology of synodality to its practice of synodality.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be helpful for us and for our rapprochement.
Mm-hmm.
So we just have a couple of minutes left. I mean, any final comments, thoughts, any sort of? No. Okay. All right. Well, we've come to the end of our time here, and I want to thank both of you for educating us, for challenging us, and for helping us to think through some of these issues related to synodality. We hope that we, in some ways, offer some suggestions about what the Latin Rite Catholics can learn from the Orthodox and the Eastern Catholic and Eastern Catholic churches. But I think it's a broader Christian discussion, right? I mean, I just really think that synodality is part of the Christian language, and I think we all have something to learn from each other. So I think I'm being prompted here to say something. So I feel like I'm a TV news anchorman, and someone's prompting me to say something here. Please join us. Here we go. For the next installment of the series, Pope Francis, Vision of Synodal Church, Salam and Ignatian Tradition, with Maria Bingamer from Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro and Austin Ivory of Campion Hall, moderated by Peter Casarella of Duke Divinity School. And there's a registration in the chat, right? And if you have not already done so, please take 2 minutes to provide feedback on the event by filling out the survey, and you might even be able to get a $25 gift card. May I also offer a plug here for our Orthodox Christian Study Center on Public Orthodoxy. So I invite you, especially if you want to engage some of the issues surrounding, synodality, but also obviously things happening in Ukraine and the Russian attack on Ukraine, and how that's also how the role of religion is involved in all those things. And we have quite a few excellent essays by Father Cyril himself. So again, thank you both very, very much, and we thank all of you for joining us, and we wish you all a good night.